Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you. This is our first event of the new academic year, and if there are members of the class of 2015 in the audience, a very warm welcome to you. We'll hope to see you many times here at the Dickey Center during your Dartmouth tenures. And again, thanks also for coming out on a kind of a miserable day. We've had some good luck with the weather, but so be it, so be it. Today we're going to be focusing on, I'm putting my old diplomatic hat back on again for a moment, to me, one of the most important relationships that the United States has. Canada, our neighbor to the north, it's an extraordinary relationship that we enjoy with Canada. The border is protected, obviously, but it's a very friendly border, although sometimes crossing back and forth, it may not be quite that. But we speak the same language. We have, a very, very close relationship. And what we're going to be exploring today is the nature of the U.S.-Canadian partnership today. But tomorrow and on Saturday, there will be a second conference going on, which will involve some wonderful academics from Dartmouth and Canadian universities. And I'll mention the participants and the institutions in just a moment. But today and tomorrow, we're going to look at this really intriguing question of why, two countries who share so much in terms of the strategic outlook of the world, as you'll hear, we don't always approach foreign policy issues in the same way. And what gives rise to these differences? How do we look at the world? How do we look at emerging issues? How do we look at international institutions? What do we think about military security items? So this is really what's going to focus our attention for the next 2 days. And I'm just delighted that this is going to be the first event of this year because we at the Dickey Center have been very purposefully trying to increase, what we're doing on Canada. This is for a number of reasons, and I'm going to start by just reading a little bit, not reading, but also using a very interesting booklet entitled The World's Troubles. And this was John Sloan Dickey on American Foreign Policy. And it was written several years ago by Lyons, who was one of the early directors of the Dickey Center and who was a professor of government here for many years. And what he writes about is that for John Sloan Dickey, of course, our namesake, the U.S.-Canadian relationship was very, very important. From a personal view, there were family ties to Canada. And also, he was very much interested in this very unusual case of international cooperative arrangements along a 3,000-mile boundary, across which every day there were just innumerable exchanges, economic, social, and cultural. And yet he felt, as I do, that Canada was almost taken for granted by most Americans, with little interest or concern for what's happening north of the border. And according to Lyons, there were two sort of major components, two major theses in Dickey's work. And the first is that it was in the interests of the United States that Canada remain independent in their relationship with the United States. For one thing, and I quote now John Sloan Dickey, it is in the self-interest of this country to be subject to an independent, critical scrutiny, free of both the hostility of an adversary and the acquiescence of a sycophant. And the second function of Canadian independence that is of immeasurable value to the long-term goals of American foreign policy, according to Dickey, was that it is the capacity as an important middle power to take initiatives that the United States could not possibly take itself, but that serve to enhance stability in world politics. So I offer those thoughts from someone from John Sloan Dickey, as I said, who is very, very much focused on the U.S.-Canadian relationship. And we have been trying very purposefully, as I said, over the last few years, to increase the programming and to increase the attention given to the U.S.-Canadian relationship here at Dickey. We are offering for the first time in recent memory a new course in the college on U.S.-Canadian relations, and that was taught by Stephanie Van Halotke, who will be, I don't know if Stephanie's here. There she is. Good to see you, Steph. I'm sorry. Also a new mother, and congratulations. But she taught this course and did a wonderful job, introducing this course this year. And we purposefully are trying to have that course taught by a Canadian, Stephanie from McGill and others. And we're hoping, to have another very, very esteemed Canadian academic teach that course this coming year. We had a major conference here at Dartmouth just about 2 months ago on Arctic health issues. And we had a wonderful contingent of Canadian Arctic specialists who are specialists in health areas, and from a number of universities, McGill and others. And that was another very good sort of building block, in the cooperation that we're trying to build. And the third thing I'll mention is the conference, which will take place tomorrow. And at this point, I really would like to sort of set out a number of people for some very special thanks in the development and the coordination of this particular event. And first, I want to thank very much the Government of Canada and the representatives of that government who are here today. Deborah Lyons, the Deputy Head of Mission at the Canadian Embassy in Washington. Is Patrick here yet? Patrick Binns is no. About 10 minutes, okay. Patrick is the Consul General of the Canadian Consulate in Boston, and Aaron Anabel, who's here, and particularly Mark Jacques, with whom we've worked, I think, for probably 5 or 6 years already. But it's just been a pleasure, and I just want to thank the Government of Canada, the Embassy, and the Consulate for this really generous support that we've had, both financially and otherwise. And I also want to recognize Jean-Stéphane Bernard. Jean, yeah, there you are. Jean is from the Quebec, the provincial government, and he's their representative here, and he worked with us on this conference. But I would like to say that the conference tomorrow, which is entitled How Canada and the United States Respond to Global Security Challenges, the partners, and this really is a binational effort, the partners are the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, the McGill University of Montreal Center for International Peace and Security Studies, the Center for International and Defense Policy at Queen's University, and of course, the Canadian Embassy. And I just wanted to mention several of the individuals who've worked on this conference. There are other academics who are here, so I'm not going to mention everyone's name because we'll be doing that tomorrow. But I particularly want to thank Stephanie, who was right with us in the planning all the way from the beginning. Kim Nossel, Kim is there, thank you. Is Frederic here, Frederic Morand? Not yet, but Frederic Morand. TV Paul, there's TV. And finally, Bill and Chris Wolforth from Dartmouth, who were really instrumental, and Bill is right here. So I just wanted to thank all of you for all that you did. What I'd like to do now is to introduce the speakers on our panel. And we have 2 main presenters, and we're very, very fortunate today to have them. And then we have 2 discussants, and we're equally fortunate to have them. We just could not have more qualified and better positioned individuals to come and talk to us about the U.S.-Canadian relationship. And the first speaker will be Deborah Lyons, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission, Deputy Head of Mission at the Canadian Embassy in Washington. And I met Deborah for the first time about an hour or so ago, and I feel like I've known her a long time already. She's absolutely terrific, and you're going to really enjoy hearing from her. Thank you. She previously held positions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in Canada, including Assistant Deputy Minister of the Strategic Policy and Planning Department, Director of the International Finance Department, and Director General of the North America Commercial Affairs Department. And she's also had several overseas postings at Canadian embassies in Asia and the Caribbean. And a pleasure to introduce her U.S. counterpart, who I just met also for the first time and delighted, Jim Nealon. Jim arrived in Ottawa in August of 2010 and serving as the Deputy Chief of Mission, as I said, at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. Before coming to Canada, he served as the DCM, the Deputy Chief of Mission, excuse my old lingo, at the U.S. Embassies in Lima, Peru, and Montevideo, Uruguay. And he's also served as Counselor for Public Affairs at the U.S. Embassies in Madrid, Spain, and Budapest, Hungary. And he served as Press Attaché at the embassies in Manila, Philippines, and Budapest, and also as Cultural Attaché in Montevideo and Santiago, Chile. I won't say this, but I guess I will. He has a degree from another one of these bad, non-Dartmouth Ivy League institutions, Brown, but we'll forgive him that. But Jim, very glad that you're here, and thank you very much for coming. The first discussant is a very dear friend, Louise Frechette, who up until just very recently was a member of the Dickey Center Board of Visitors, and we miss her greatly now. Right now, she is a distinguished fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada. But previously, she had really a brilliant career on behalf of the Canadian Foreign Service and the Canadian government. And I'm just going to mention just a few of her, really significant achievements. She served from 1998 to 2006 as the first UN Deputy Secretary General. That's the number 2 person at the United Nations, where she assisted the Secretary General in the full range of his responsibilities and oversaw UN reform. She also served as Canada's ambassador to Argentina and Uruguay, and she also served as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations from 1992 to 1994. She's won many honors. She's become an officer of the Order of Canada, and she holds many honorary degrees from universities across Canada, in Korea, and in Italy. And I'm delighted to welcome Louise back home. It's a pleasure to have you here. And finally, and not least, a very dear friend, Beth Jones, Elizabeth Jones, Ambassador Elizabeth Jones, who served with great distinction as Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. In that assignment, she designed U.S. policies for NATO and the European Union countries, Russia, Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, and she was my boss, I'm very happy to say, when I was ambassador out in Georgia. And she supervised 54 U.S. ambassadors and their embassies. She served as the U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Near Eastern Bureau, Senior Advisor for Caspian Energy Diplomacy, Executive Assistant to then Secretary of State Warren Christopher, and DCM at the U.S. Embassy in Bonn and also in Islamabad, Pakistan. She's now a senior counselor at APCO Worldwide, which is a consulting organization, and as I said, a very good friend. So I'm delighted to welcome all 4 of you, and I'm going to ask Deborah if you would begin. Thank you, everyone. Also wanted to say thank you to a Dartmouth alum, Dave Reynolds, and his wife, May. Dave is in the back. But Dave has been a very strong supporter of this conference and a conference that preceded it. So I just wanted to recognize your wonderful work. Thank you, Deborah.
Just start off as well as Ken did by particularly welcoming all of the Dartmouth students who are here this afternoon. This is my first school year as a parent without a child in school or university. And I have to say I felt really quite lost at the end of August when I couldn't go shopping for all the school supplies. And it's just lovely to see all of the young people here. Let me tell you what I say about the world right now, and if I were a young person, I want to live another 100 years so that I can work on the whole issue of failing and fragile states. Because I think how we as the US and Canada and the other developed countries, economies, work with these fragile countries around the world will be the hallmark of the kind of future that we want to create. So I welcome you to this session, and I say join the Foreign Service, work abroad. It is an incredibly inspiring career. First of all, thank you, Ken. Thank you to Dartmouth College and the Dickey Center for International Understanding. What a wonderful phrase to have tagged to your name, Center for International Understanding. For inviting us here this afternoon to talk about Canada-US relations and the opportunity in particular to participate in the session tomorrow. Even this afternoon, meeting up with the various academics who are going to be participating in the conference tomorrow, I was reminded of just how critical it is for us as civil servants, public servants, as foreign service officers to get closer to the academic community. We need your wisdom, we need your research, we need your guidance. We spend a bit more time than we'd like to with the government minutiae. And I think we need your fresh ideas and your insights. So I'm very much looking forward tomorrow to the opportunity to benefit from your wisdom. As another testimonial to the Canada-US relationship, Jim Nealon and I were talking about how really we're both going to say the same thing. There may be a few areas where we would disagree a little bit, but the relationship is very strong right now. We've come through some very interesting issues in the last decade. And so Jim has kindly agreed that maybe I can take a bit more time, and then he'll just come in after me and correct anything I've said wrong. So I'm going to go on a little bit, and then both of us have agreed that since we've got Beth and Louise here to critique us, if Jim and I talk long, they'll have less time to critique. So there's a little method to my madness, but Ken has been given the authority to use the hook on me if he needs to. I'm going to talk in three main broad categories, really. I'm going to talk a little bit at the outset about the origin of our Canada-US values and where they've stemmed from and how they're leading us. I'm going to talk a little bit about the bilateral relationship because as a diplomat in Washington, I never miss the opportunity to brag about Canada, and in particular to brag about the Canada-US relationship because I think it is so tremendously solid now, so strong. And then thirdly, of course, I will talk about the main focus of this afternoon's session, that is where we are going in this global partnership out onto the world stage. But I think it's important that you have a sense of the bilateral relationship and how much it is strengthened, because that is informing and instructing us as we move forward. So let me begin. Next year, we will commemorate the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. And in perfect Canada-US relationship style, we are still talking about who won. We, I think, both agree that probably Britain lost, but we don't really get into whether we won or they won. During those 200 years, we have built the closest, warmest, most integrated, and most successful relationship in the world. It is the envy of other countries. As President Obama said this past February, Canada and the United States are not simply allies or neighbors. We are bound together by our societies, our economies, and our families. At the core of this friendship is the largest trading relationship in the world. Not only is the US Canada's largest export market, but Canada is also the largest customer for US goods, larger than China, larger than Japan, and larger than all 27 EU countries combined. In total, approximately 8 million jobs in the US depend on trade with Canada, and the health of both of our economies depends on ensuring the uninterrupted flow of goods and services and people across our borders. Canada and the US are also allies in the defense of our continent through NORAD, joint law enforcement cooperation, and through counterterrorism activities. As Prime Minister Harper has said, a threat to the United States is a threat to Canada. Given our shared values, most notably those of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, Canada and the United States work together very closely on the international stage, whether it's in Afghanistan, Libya, Haiti. We have common cause and interest on a vast range of issues, and that instructs our partnership abroad. But of course, although we are allies and friends with a common history and geography, we are very distinct countries with our own approaches to domestic security and foreign policy questions. While Canada is not a large country geographically, it has a relatively small population, and of course most of that population is located in cities very close to the American border. Through most of our history, our geography has been a source of security, as vast oceans on three sides now have kept most dangers and crises distant from our shores. As Prime Minister Mackenzie King observed to the League of Nations in 1936, we in Canada are particularly fortunate, both in our neighbors and in our lack of neighbors. Canada's evolution has been much different than that of the United States. This is very important to ponder. Our development has been an incremental one, lacking in revolutions, and instead developing through long processes and compromise. I often say the US broke away from the mothership, and Canada crawled away gently with the mother waving goodbye as we went. It changes the psyche of the people, that type of origin and evolution. Therefore, instead of the stirring life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we have the very Canadian peace, order, and good governance. From the beginning, Canada has been a mixture of different peoples and cultures, with the British and the French and the First Nations having strongly influenced Canada's structure and in particular its bilingual nature. However, while these three peoples remain an integral part of the Canadian fabric, the Canada of today is a mosaic of the different peoples, faiths, languages, and cultures. I think it is still true today. It used to be very popular in the 70s and 80s to speak of the US as the melting pot and Canada as the vertical mosaic. I think Canada is still that mosaic. Canada has always been a country of immigrants, and that was never truer than it is today, where approximately 1 in 5 Canadians were born overseas. Think about how that influences our domestic and international policies, and I'm sure that'll be part of our discussion tomorrow. Our relative sizes also give Canada and the United States a different perspective on international affairs and our role within them. Canadians have always seen their interests as best served by strong alliances and a strong international system of rules. Realistically, it is not possible to defend Canada or the United States without defending North America. And our countries have had a long history of cooperation on continental defense. This can be seen in NORAD, Canada Command, and Northern Command, and through the close cooperation between our two militaries, where numerous joint training exercises, procurement policies, and personnel exchanges have enhanced the interoperability of our forces. When I ask American and Canadian military to describe the relationship, what would be the word that would best describe it? Strong, friendly, whatever, they always use the word interoperability. No two forces anywhere in the world can come close to the degree of interoperability between the Canadian and the US forces. Internationally, Canada has recognized the need to participate in international peace and security missions, whether through United Nations peacekeeping missions or as part of the NATO alliance. Likewise, Canada's economic interests are best served by a strong system of international rules, and Canada has one of the largest economies in the world, but to a greater degree than the United States, our economic fate and fortune has always been linked to foreign trade and investment. Whether as a colony within an empire, or as a nation whose development and prosperity hinged on the economic ties to the rest of the world, and most notably to our southern neighbor. So let me talk for a few moments about those ties to that southern neighbor and about this incredibly strong bilateral relationship that binds us and impacts our relationship with the rest of the world. I know I can say this quite strongly, and Jim and I have often talked about it. I have never seen the Canada-US relationship as strong as it is now. The last decade has been a difficult one, without question. But because of some of those difficulties and challenges, our two governments have had to work very closely on issues that impact that bilateral relationship. And because of that, I think now we are standing in an incredibly strong position as partners. We still have issues, we still have irritants, but we are moving forward. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the areas that are most critical to us right now. Since the signing of the Canada-US trade agreement in the 80s and NAFTA in the 90s, our two economies have continued to integrate to the point where over $1 million worth of goods and services cross our borders every minute of every day. I say to my trade staff, the motto is $1 million a minute, $1 million a minute, $1 million a minute. And do you really ever want to have that interrupted? Because it benefits both economies. In 2010, our bilateral trade was close to $650 billion, and it is important to note that this is two-way trade, with Canada being the largest customer for US goods anywhere in the world. Beyond exports and imports, it is important to recognize the fundamental ways that our two economies are integrated through trade, investment, and merged value chains. In fact, each country has more than $250 billion invested in the other. And there are some 5,000 Canadian businesses that directly employ more than 500,000 Americans across the country. Another example that I like to use that I think helps to illuminate this, 30% of the exports going to Canada are an import into products that we then export back into the United States. Something like 25% of the exports going into the US are coming from US companies based in Canada. This is an integrated economy. And this economic integration demands a border that is open and efficient. However, it is just as critical that it remains secure, as the safety of our citizens always will remain the top priority for both countries. This is why Canada and the US are taking a more coordinated approach by pushing out the perimeter of our continent as far as possible to keep out people and goods that pose a threat to our countries before they reach our shores. And so that is why in February our two leaders met and announced the Canada-US shared vision for perimeter security and economic competitiveness. This will provide a way forward to accomplish both of these goals. The vision for the shared the shared vision for perimeter security, which we commonly on the street now call Beyond the Border, focuses on 4 key areas of cooperation: trade facilitation, economic growth and jobs, integrated cross-border law enforcement, and critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. Complementary to this, they announced the Regulatory Cooperation Council. This is formed to look at a number of the regulations and the opportunity for greater cooperation in those regulations and the simplification of those regulations in a number of key sectors that are critical to our economies. Work on both of these fronts has progressed incredibly well. There has been an enormous amount of work over the summer. Both leaders, President Obama and Prime Minister Harper, both assigned senior people to this file, and in both cases they reported directly to the leaders. There has been an enormous amount of consultation across the country, both countries, and my advice to you is watch this space. In the next couple of weeks, maybe the next couple of months, depending on how much other issues come in to crowd the space, we are hoping to hear an announcement on the action plans for both of these initiatives. These are huge initiatives that will go a long way in cementing both security and prosperity. As well, the global economic crisis has affected both countries and means that for both governments, the primary focus must be jobs and employment. For Canada, the economic crisis has been less devastating than it has been for the United States, largely because we did not have the same crisis in the financial sector. And because we entered the recession with fiscal space necessary to invest in stimulus. I'm happy to mention that the World Economic Forum has rated Canada's banking system as the soundest since 2008. I'm also happy to say that The Economist magazine has named Canada as the best place in all of the G7 to start a business in the next 5 years. Our fundamentals are good, and we're happy, very happy to see that. But at the same time, the integrated economy with the United States means that we are very concerned about economic prosperity here and a number of the issues that we share with the United States being dealt with. In this regard, Canada and the United States have continued to work closely, both bilaterally, as is evidenced by the combined effort that we went to prevent Chrysler from going bankrupt. An integrated sector requires an integrated response from the two governments. And multilaterally, where we have worked closely to ensure that the G20 has remained focused on realistic and pragmatic solutions. We're also, of course, and I would advise you to watch carefully some of the other areas where we're working together. We have the Detroit River International Crossing, which carries a great deal of the product back and forth. We're hoping for a second crossing to be announced sometime in the coming months. This will have a big impact as well on the economic integration and security of the two countries. In addition to the areas of manufacturing, the Canada-US energy market is truly integrated, with a series of cross-border oil and natural gas pipelines, as well as integrated electricity grids. And I know that this is an issue of concern here in New Hampshire. Canada now exports 2.5 million barrels per day of crude oil and petroleum products to the United States. It's equal to about 20% of U.S. imports in the energy area. Our reserves are amongst the third largest in the world. The existence of such a large proportion of the world's petroleum reserves in Canada is a strategic fact of life in the United States, and I would argue it is maybe a strategic lifeline. The top 10 reserves around the world are found in Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Canada, Iraq, UAE, Kuwait, Iran, Russia, Libya, and Nigeria. So I ask you, who would you like to buy your oil from? The good news is that Canada can supply even more oil to the United States. The Government of Canada strongly supports the expansion of the Keystone Pipeline, which will deliver oil from Alberta to the Gulf Coast refineries in Texas, thereby contributing to energy security in both countries. The Keystone Pipeline is designed to replace declining heavy oil supply from Mexico and Venezuela. And again, if not Keystone, then the alternative is more oil from the Middle East. Again, this is a very interesting area to watch. We are waiting to hear the decision of the administration with regard to the permit for the Keystone Pipeline, and in the coming weeks, around all of the states impacted by the Keystone Pipeline, there will be public hearings. So you'll see a lot of this in the news in the next while. Canada is also committed to ensuring that the environmental performance of the oil sands continues to improve. 2008 emissions intensity of oil sands production has fallen 39% since 1990 due to the advances in technology. All of this is getting better. And as well, the shared environment has long been a top bilateral priority for our two countries, dating back to the signing of the Boundary Waters Treaty in 1909 and the creation of the International Joint Commission. We have had bilateral institutions dealing with the many issues that we face with our joint border. The joint stewardship of our environment continues today as the two countries have made the same commitment to reduce GHG emissions by 17% by 2020. And we are taking steps to address this, most recently through legislation on light vehicle emissions and coal, and the two leading contributors to GHG. Canada is currently working on legislation for other sectors, including heavy vehicle emissions. And again, it's obvious why we have to move hand in hand with the United States, particularly on things like light vehicle and heavy vehicle. We have an integrated auto sector. Any regulations and policies need to be coordinated between the two countries, or we stand in the way of business. So, as you can see, there's been a lot of work in economic integration in the last 10 years. A lot of issues have been dealt with, particularly since 9/11, and the very difficult issues we had around the border. We have a lot of things happening this fall, though. Beyond the border decisions, the regulatory co-op, Keystone Pipeline, the second crossing in Detroit, ongoing water issues that we will continue to have along our border, and then, of course, the recent discussions on Buy America, all mean that we need to continue to do this work, but we have had significant success, significant progress. And as I said, the two countries are stronger now in their partnership than ever before. So where does that take us then as partners on the global stage, the area of most interest to all of you? Canada and the US, as I said, share a number of important values that guide our work internationally. As I said, most notably freedom, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. While Canada and the US share similar views on most international issues, we obviously have different roles to play given our relative sizes. For Canada as a traditional middle power, this means identifying a smaller number of true priorities and focusing our efforts and resources there, often, almost always, in concert with the US and other international partners. So let me take you on a quick tour around the world and talk about where we are putting our resources and what that means perhaps in terms of our discussion about the global partnership. Over the past decade, the best example of this work has been our contribution in Afghanistan with the United States and our other NATO partners. From the fall of 2001, and after the events of 9/11, to this past summer, Canada played an active role in Afghanistan, deploying almost 3,000 soldiers and some 200 civilians to our embassy in Kabul and to Canada's civilian military operations in Kandahar province, the latter being considered one of the most volatile and bloody provinces in the country and the heartland of the insurgency. Canada has lost 157 soldiers and 1 diplomat in Kandahar, among the highest proportion of casualties in the alliance. While Canada has now transitioned to a training mission, it is important to note that we are still the second largest contributor in the NATO training mission after the United States, with 950 military trainers and 50 police trainers. Canada's political and development commitment to Afghanistan is also unwavering, represented by our continuing robust diplomatic presence in Kabul. Canada and the United States have a shared history, both tragedies and successes, in Afghanistan, and our mutual experiences there have only strengthened our deep military and diplomatic bonds. Let me move now then to the Middle East. This is an area where we have all witnessed a tumultuous year. Upheavals have run across the entire region, resulting in one of the greatest diplomatic challenges of the past half-century. The peoples of the region have demanded change and accountability from their governments. As in all such seminal events, tremendous opportunities exist for more freedom and improving quality of life. But serious risks also lie in wait, such as extremism or a fallback to authoritarianism. We all know that nobody can predict with any certainty the outcomes. Arab peoples must take the lead. This is their movement. But countries such as Canada and the United States must be prepared to help where we can and where we are able. As different countries in the region take different paths, so too our responses must differ. Canada supports the popular calls for political and economic reform in the region, based on democracy, the rule of law, respect for human rights, and tolerance for minorities. We must help promote greater economic opportunities, especially among the many young people there. Without diminishing the importance of what has occurred in Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, and elsewhere, I want to focus in on Libya and Syria. In Libya, Canada, in concert with the unprecedented coalition, I'll say that again because I think it's important for all of us to note this, the unprecedented coalition of other nations and international organizations, Canada fully supported and implemented the UN Security Council sanctions and mandate to protect civilians. Canada acted quickly and decisively from the beginning of the crisis, along with our close allies, the US, the UK, and France. Canadian aircraft participated in the NATO campaigns of aerial strikes against threats to the civilian population, and we continued these operations. We had a frigate patrol in the Gulf to enforce the arms embargo. Lieutenant General Bouchard, some of you may know, a Canadian officer, is the overall commander of the UN-authorized NATO action. We provided some $10 million in humanitarian assistance to the affected crisis. We've recognized the National Transitional Council as the legitimate government of Libya. We have lifted sanctions and unfrozen funds, and we are now reopening our embassy in Tripoli. And you may have heard that our PM has just committed to an additional 3 months of our mission there, of our military mission. The principal challenge now, though, is to establish a peaceful and stable transition, and the Libyan people seek effective governance and institutions and a secure environment for economic development and prosperity. Canada will support these aspirations and promote a transition founded on the rule of law and the respect for human rights. Syria. This demonstrates the challenge of responding to the individual situations of the region-wide upheavals. As I said earlier, each case is different and has to be looked at on its merits. And so the international community has not yet responded with the same unanimity of purpose or determination as yet as with Libya. As of today, the Security Council has not passed a resolution on the situation, in spite of strong efforts by the US and others. However, Canada and the US and others have been active addressing the Syrian situation. We have condemned the Assad regime's violent repression of peaceful protests and continued killing of protesters in the streets. Many have said that Assad has lost his legitimacy and must step down. We as Canada have implemented sanctions against Syria and the leading figures within and supporting the regime. We must continue to isolate and exert pressure on the regime. A critical issue in this same region is, of course, Palestinian statehood. The Middle East peace process for Canada is another important factor in this region, and on this issue, our position is quite clear. We support a two-state solution, arrived at through negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. As frustrating as this process has been and can be, it is the only way to achieve a lasting peace, and we therefore do not support the Palestinian initiative at the UN, which we view as counterproductive to achieving the trust between the two primary partners. Closer to home, increased engagement in the Americas has been a key priority for the Canadian government since 2007. This is our neighborhood. And so we have identified 3 pillars within this priority: democratic governance, prosperity, and security. I brought you across the ocean from the Middle East to the Americas pretty quickly, didn't I? I should have given you warning. But the Americas has been a priority, as I said, of our government since 2007. And perhaps nowhere is our commitment to our own hemisphere better exemplified than the efforts of Canadians to help the Haitian people following the January 2010 earthquake. Our government responded swiftly with a contribution of $85 million, and then out of the hearts of Canadians came an additional $200 million that our government matched. So an additional $400 million was pledged to the people of Haiti. Canada is also working closely with our hemispheric neighbors, whether it's through free trade deals, such as those recently signed with Colombia and Panama, to again support the prosperity pillar of the Americas, or disaster response assistance to Jamaica, or increased military cooperation with countries like Chile, Brazil, and Mexico, again in support of the pillar for additional security in the Americas. To that end, Canada recently became head of the Inter-America Defense Board, and again received that nomination and that endorsement on the basis of a reform agenda that we have brought into the Inter-America Defense Board. And another important priority for Canada is the Arctic. And you might be interested to know that a recent poll of Canadians found that for the majority of Canadians, the most important foreign policy priority was the Arctic. This speaks to the growing realization of the important role the North will play both economically and environmentally, but also to the very special place that the Arctic holds in the Canadian psyche. We are a northern people, the true North strong and free, as we say. I think one of our colleagues in Congress said it best when he referred to the melting of the ice cap means that we are all inheriting another ocean. And so to this end, Canada has issued an Arctic foreign policy statement that highlights 4 priority areas: exercising sovereignty, for that there is no doubt; promoting social and economic development, of course, of the northern peoples; protecting the Arctic environment; and devolving governance. An important part of this strategy will be working cooperatively with our regional partners in the Arctic, including the United States and, of course, Russia, and we look forward to chairing the Arctic Council in 2013. And I just want to recognize the good work that's done here by the Institute of Arctic Studies, and that's wonderful work that's underway here, and I know that our consulate has done some cooperative work. That's something maybe, Ken, that we can talk a little bit about and maybe get our Prime Minister a little closer to. Moving forward, in addition to these areas in the world where we are working cooperatively, I think we and the United States see a tremendous change in the international order, and for that then a change in the international governance and international architecture. So in that regard, we are working very closely, particularly with the emergency economies, China, India, and Brazil. They are taking a much greater role on the world stage. This is obvious. Engaging with these countries, particularly China, will be of growing importance to both countries. We share a common interest in helping China integrate into the rules-based multilateral system that both of our countries helped build in the post-war era. We have a shared interest in working with China and other emerging economies to address global issues where their cooperation and engagement is essential. And to this end, I think burden sharing is an area that requires a great deal of attention by Canada, the United States, the other countries of the developed world, as we try to work more closely to bring these economies and democracies on side. The advent of the G20 in response to the onset of the global economic crisis in 2008 is concrete evidence of this and is an area where our 2 countries have worked closely together in helping the G20 frame an international response to the crisis. We also embrace, of course, and are strong supporters of the work of the G8, and particularly endorse the work that they have done recently on accountability and performance metrics as a means of demonstrating the results of the commitments that are made. So in conclusion, there is no doubt that this is our most important relationship, and it has gone through some ups and downs. The last 10 years have seen a tremendous strengthening of this relationship. We are stronger bilaterally. We still have issues, we still have irritants, but we are much better positioned to work on them than ever before. Jim and I can both tell you that we have 2 very active, if not sometimes hyperactive ambassadors who are very engaged on all of these issues. Our 2 leaders have a terrific rapport. I think Canadians and Americans understand one another better. So I have great hope for our bilateral relationship, but I think also the extent to which we have come together in that bilateral partnership means that we are stronger as we go abroad to deal with some of these very, very difficult and thorny issues that the global stage is facing. I always conclude my remarks about the Canada-US relationship by saying that people often say our strength is our shared history. I disagree. I think our strength and our inspiration is our shared future. I look forward to talking to you more about that. Thank you very much. 5 minutes left. That was great. I learned a lot.
Thanks very much, Deborah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jim Nealon. As Ambassador Yalowitz said, I'm the Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy up in Ottawa. It's a great honor to be here at Dartmouth and at the Dickey Center. I want to thank Ambassador Yalowitz and his team for the invitation. Most of you know that before he became the head of the Dickey Center, he was a very distinguished American diplomat for 36 or 56 or 76 years or some very long period of time, and a two-time American ambassador. So thank you for your service, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's also an honor to share this podium with three very, very distinguished diplomats, far more distinguished than I. Ambassador Frechette, who I had never had the pleasure of meeting before just now, but it's a pleasure to meet you. Ambassador Jones, who I had the pleasure to work for, as Ambassador Yalowitz did many years ago, not many, some years ago, when she was running the European Bureau at the Department of State, and I was a humble public affairs officer in Budapest and Madrid. So we will swap stories later. And finally, Deborah Lyons, my colleague, who's the deputy at the Canadian Embassy in Washington. We share a wonderful gift. Little-known secret that the best job in the world, certainly in the Foreign Service, is being the deputy in a very large mission in a very important foreign capital. There's just nothing like it. You make the trains run on time, you do all the dirty work, and you have the most fun. Is that right?
That's right. That's it.
Most of the time.
Most of the time. This is not my first time at Dartmouth. I first came here in 1974 when I was studying down the road in Providence. And I came up here for a cross-country meet with high hopes. I got thrashed by a very strong Dartmouth team and came back subsequent times during my college career and got thrashed each time by a very strong Dartmouth team. So I hope to do a little bit better today and erase those memories. It is very, very difficult to go second when you're talking about the U.S.-Canada relationship because, in fact, Deborah basically gave my speech. We may have to check our cybersecurity at the U.S. Embassy to see if there's been a breach, but even some of the jokes. But seriously, the fact is the relationship is so intertwined. We're so completely invested in each other in every sense of that word. The relationship is so close that it would be very difficult to give a different speech. So you'll be pleased to learn that I won't go into much detail. I'll shorten my remarks and go for about 10 minutes, but there are a couple of points that I want to make. First of all, maybe I'll give you 3 statistics that'll sort of graphically show you the importance that the U.S.-Canada relationship plays for the United States. The first one's kind of an odd one, but stick with me here. To enter Canada and do business with your Canadian counterparts, any official of the United States government has to ask the embassy for what we call country clearance, and Ambassador Jones will remember this very well. In other words, you have to ask the embassy for permission to enter Canada to do business with your Canadian counterparts. And the reasons for this are pretty obvious. It's so that the U.S. government can act in a coordinated fashion, speak with one voice, not trip over ourselves, make sure that policy is coordinated across departments and agencies, both in Ottawa and in Washington. So it makes sense. So when I was in Uruguay doing a similar job, we had a couple hundred U.S. government officials come to Uruguay during the course of a year. In Canada, that number is closer to 20,000. So, and these are the ones that we know of. About 20,000 American government officials come to Canada for a day, a couple of days, or a week to do business with their Canadian counterparts. And they're working on things like trade, extraditions, water quality, air quality, defense, health, agriculture, science, academic exchange. If the government does it, we do it in coordination with each other. It's really quite phenomenal. The second stat I wanted to share with you was one that Deborah shamelessly stole from me previously, and this is the statistic that that we trade about $1 million in goods per minute across the border. And what this adds up to in the course of a day is $1.5 billion in trade every single day of every single year. It's the largest trading relationship in the history of the world. It dwarfs our trade with China, with the European Union, and with any other country in the world. As a matter of fact, the increase in trade that we anticipate for this year is larger than our trade with France, Brazil, other countries that are huge trading partners. That's the magnitude of this relationship. The third stat I wanted to share with you is people. Every day, about 300,000 people cross the border, over 10,000 people an hour. You add that all up, it's about 100 million people a year crossing the border in both directions. Imagine what it takes bureaucratically to process all of those people, 100 million people every year. Imagine the need for security, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those three statistics sort of give you an idea of the magnitude of the relationship. So with that, let me tell you very, very quickly how we in the Embassy in Ottawa view the bilateral relationship on a day-to-day basis and sort of how we break down our work. First of all, of course, is the border. The border is 7,000 kilometers, 4,000 miles long. It's the linchpin of our mutual prosperity and our mutual security. As I said a minute ago, 300,000 people and $1.5 billion in goods cross it every day. So the border and all that that implies is really front and center in everything that we do every day at the Embassy in Ottawa. You may have heard, and Deborah just mentioned, two initiatives that were launched in February by Prime Minister Harper and President Obama. The shorthand that we use to describe these are perimeter security, or beyond the border, and regulatory cooperation. We can talk a little bit more about those later if you'd like to, but we expect an announcement in the coming weeks or months that will outline action plans for both of those initiatives and a way forward. And this is probably the biggest thing in the bilateral relationship since NAFTA. I think that's a fair characterization. The second organizing principle that we use at the Embassy, of course, is trade. You may have heard politicians in the United States talk about jobs recently. And Deborah again alluded to the fact that U.S. exports to Canada are responsible for about 8 million jobs in the United States. Here in New Hampshire, the number we use is about 40,000 jobs depend directly or indirectly on trade with Canada. All right? So we spend a tremendous amount of our time and energy trying to increase trade so that we can create more jobs and more prosperity for our people on both sides of the border. We've been fairly successful at that. In spite of bad economic times, challenging economic times, U.S. exports to Canada rose over 20% in 2010, and Canadian exports to the U.S. rose even more. And so far this year in 2011, we're up another 13%. So I can't translate that precisely into jobs created, but it would be in the many thousands. And one of the things that's different about U.S.-Canada trade, beyond its sheer volume, is the degree to which our supply chains are completely integrated. And again, Deborah spoke a little bit about this. And the most obvious example is the auto sector. And if you talk to the automakers either in Windsor, Ontario, or in Detroit, Michigan, they'll tell you that even they don't know at the end of the day how much product is U.S. content and how much content is Canadian content. A vehicle may cross the border 6 or 7 times in the course of its manufacture and get value added either in Michigan or in Ontario at each step. It really is a completely integrated supply chain. So we like to say we don't just sell things to each other, we make things together. Right? So if you add that $500 billion annual trade relationship to the $500 billion investment relationship that we have, it's a $1 trillion economic relationship. It's the envy of the world. The third thing I wanted to mention is energy. And Deborah spoke about this a bit, but if you ask most Americans to name our largest foreign supplier of energy, what would most Americans say? Saudi Arabia, right? Now, a sophisticated, worldly audience like this one, just 3 hours from the border, of course, you knew that the answer is Canada, and it's Canada in all forms of imported energy. We buy 20% of our imported oil from Canada, 80% of our natural gas imports come from Canada, and virtually every kilowatt of the electricity, raw electricity that we import comes from Canada. And Canada has vast reserves of hydroelectric energy, mostly in Quebec, that is there for the purchasing. So we spend a lot of time and energy on this energy relationship, the value of which on an annual basis is about $100 billion. Finally, good old foreign policy, what we in the embassy sort of call Canada in the world. How can we in the United States work together with Canada to make the world a more prosperous and a more peaceful place? And Deborah went over in some detail, so I won't do it again, but suffice it to say that we spend a lot of time every single day speaking to the highest levels of the Canadian government, directly coordinating our foreign policies. And these conversations, I think you'd be shocked if you heard them. There's very little of the diplo-speak or the gobbledygook in them. These are very, very, very direct conversations about how we're going to work together in the world and move forward. You know, you don't fight together in a place like Afghanistan unless you're very direct and very honest with each other. And that's the type of relationship that we have with Canada. So I promised 10 minutes. I'm going to leave it there, and I hope after we hear from our commentarists, we'll have some time to hear from you and your questions and comments. Thanks very much.
Does that work? Yeah, good. First of all, thank you very much, Ambassador Yelowitz, for bringing me back to Dartmouth. I really, truly enjoyed the 5 years. I sat on the board of visitors of the Dickey Center. I will admit that my prime reason for accepting the invitation was because I never had a chance to go to an American university. I certainly didn't go to an Ivy League, and I wanted to know what it was like. I was fascinated by the notion that I would have a particular entry into a very, very prestigious and very old American institution. And this was a great pleasure for me to be associated with Dartmouth all these years. I will not make too many comments because you will have ample opportunity to hear from me tomorrow. So I'll make only 2 points. The first is that we do have a very good relationship. There is a really strong relationship between the United States and Canada. But you have to realize that it's a challenging relationship. If you watch around the world, most countries anchor their foreign policy in their region. You look at Europe, you look at Latin America, you look at Asia, you have institutional arrangements on a regional basis that serve as the primary anchor of most countries' foreign policy. We, Canada, are in a region of two. You and us. And it's a very unequal relationship. You know, if you go to Europe, if you go to Latin America, you have a mix of countries, big and small, which generates a certain kind of equilibrium among the partners. In the case of Canada, United States, it is a very unequal relationship. Here you sit next to the #1 superpower in the world. Canada is not a small country, but it's not on a par, and it is challenging for Canada to have the kind of productive relation we've managed to develop over the years with the United States. Issues that matter a great deal for Canadians don't even make page 32 in the New York Times. They're too small to matter, and yet for us they may matter enormously. Canada was one of the first countries, and not the first country, to break the golden rule of diplomatic relation, which said that you only dealt with the government of the country to which you were accredited. You dealt with the administration. And Canada, 30, 40 years ago, concluded that if it dealt only with the administration, it would never get anywhere. In order for its issues to receive the attention they needed, you needed to go to the congressmen and the senators of the region where the issue at hand mattered. So it is a challenging relationship. Canadians are a lot more sensitive about the relationship with the United States than the other way around. But at the end of the day, despite the fact that it is a very challenging proposition for Canada, I think it has worked tremendously well. It has, on the whole, historically been a very productive relationship. And I think it is because at the bottom, the people, Canadians want to stay Canadians, and they're very proud of being different, but at the same time, there's quite a lot of natural sympathy for Americans. When they come to the United States, they feel at home, and I think that guarantees that whatever political differences or difficulty arise, that there's such deep roots of friendship and understanding that it is going to continue to be a strongly positive relationship. My second point is to note that both our speakers have spent quite a bit of their presentation on economic issues, economic and trade issues, and I think rightly so, because this conference is dedicated to security issues, but quite frankly, if the world economy continues to deteriorate as we've observed over the last couple of years, if the economies of our countries, of some of our countries, I should say, continues to be so shaky, then I think all our security ambitions will be, risk being thwarted. So I think it was very wise on their part to remind us of the importance of the economic dimension of the relationship between the two countries. But I must say that Canada, along with a few other G20 countries, is starting to get really, really worried about the state of the world economy, so much so that today, the Prime Minister of Canada, along with the Prime Minister of Australia, Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, and the UK, have signed an open letter to President Sarkozy of France as the chair of the G20, urging the leaders of the G20 to take the actions that are necessary to set the world economy on a more positive track. And their comments are quite pointed about Europe. And they also make direct reference to the problems in Washington and in the United States. Now, these countries, I'm not quite sure UK fits in that list, but all the other ones are countries that, for one reason or another, were forced to put their economic house in order a while back, that have weathered the first phase of the crisis quite well, but are now terribly worried and therefore have taken the unprecedented step of challenging their close partners in the G20 to face reality and take the decisions that are needed. So I think, Ken, I thought your phrase when you quoted John Sloan Dickey, that it was nice to have a relationship that was free of the acquiescence of a sycophant. Well, certainly today our Prime Minister didn't act as a sycophant, and I hope there will be appreciation of the fact that they don't have the acquiescence of a sycophant. I'll stop here. Thank you.
I'd like to echo the thanks of my distinguished colleagues here to the Dickey Center, to Ambassador Yalowitz for inviting me to participate in this event. I'm looking forward to our discussion tomorrow as well. Both Ambassador Yalowitz and Jim Nealon noted that we had worked together in the past, and I thank them very much for those references. But I must also say that their truly excellent work was very appreciated by me and by many others, in particular because they made me look good. So thank you. Thank you for that. I'd like to talk about two things only. I want to leave time for discussion. The first is more in personal terms of how I, as an American diplomat, working for many, many years overseas, mostly in the Middle East and South Asia, thought about my colleagues in the Canadian Embassy. And every place I served, there was a Canadian Embassy, hopefully next door in some cases. I thought of my Canadian colleagues as my sanity check. That's where I went always for a quick check. That's the first place I went when I first arrived in the country. Tell me what's going on here. How do you look at things here? Because of the tradition in my mind of like-mindedness in terms of the way we looked at foreign policy issues, the way we dealt with foreign governments in many, many cases. We're not identical by any means, but often with very similar approaches and attitudes about particularly the kinds of issues that were terribly important to us in the Middle East, human rights, democracy, good governance, rule of law, those kinds of issues. And not only did I think of my Canadian colleagues as what I call a sanity check, are the kinds of things that we're hearing, what you're hearing also, are people telling us things that we want to hear or they think we want to hear, what's really happening out there, because Canada was not quite the superpower, and people would say things possibly more honestly to our Canadian colleagues than they might to us, which was always a very helpful check, sanity check, for us in terms of how we might react and respond. But our Canadian colleagues were also, in many instances, the place where, as I think it was Deborah put it, where Canada could take initiatives that the U.S. couldn't. There was a period of time, for instance, when I was working in the Middle East, where Henry Kissinger had agreed that we would not deal with the PLO, with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. But we had to know what in the world the PLO was thinking and doing in order to know how to negotiate or how to even set forward negotiating possibilities for the Middle East. And it was our Canadian colleagues who often had those connections with the PLO, and we would have very close connections and consultations with our Canadian colleagues on what kinds of questions might you ask the PLO the next time you saw them, so that we might actually have some very good ideas on how to proceed. When I was working on Iran issues, from Washington, we had a trilateral group. We wanted to talk to the EU about their experiences with Iran, because we didn't have formal diplomatic relations. And, you know, the EU is a very big group, very, very important to the United States. But equally important to us is what does Canada think? So we had a trilateral group. It was the US, Canada, the EU that had little trilateral consultations regularly about what was going on in Iran. What was the next things we should do? How should we behave? When I served in Baghdad, the Canadian embassy were the ones that had the relationship with the Iraqi leadership. The Iraqis weren't going to talk to us. We had an intersection. You know, my best friends were the Canadian embassy there, and the Australian, I must say, to help us out in terms of understanding what was really going on. So I wanted to throw that in there as sort of from a practical level, what our relationship, this very close, like-minded relationship with Canada was for somebody like me and many, many of my colleagues in terms of how we went about thinking of how to proceed with our diplomatic efforts and our advocacy efforts in so many of these countries. Louise mentioned this is the second point I want to make very quickly. Mentioned the centers of preponderance of power in various parts of the world. There are centers which are led by the countries of that particular, or a country in that particular region, or a couple of countries in that region, and that it's different for the United States and Canada in that respect. I think I'd like to take that a step further, and I have this from some speeches that a very good colleague of ours, that Chaz Freeman has been making about the sort of the devolution of power and the reduction, really, of the U.S. as an overwhelming global power. That's not quite the case anymore, and rightly or wrongly, I think, in my opinion, rightly so. But as we look at the reduction of the power of the global institutions, as well as the global U.S. power that we used to think about and talk about in the last decade, it means that there are different patterns of behavior evolving in regions, so that you may no longer look at a particular regional organization like NATO or an international global organization like the UN to solve the problems, but you pick parts of each of those and form ad hoc organizations or have an ad hoc conference to try to solve some of these problems. That's all well and good so long as it works, so long as it actually is pushing toward to solving some of these issues, or at least addressing some of these issues. And here's where I would like to put forward the notion that the United States and Canada still has a very strong partnership in to some extent leading some of these discussions, certainly participating in these discussions, that the leadership that we pursue together in NATO and Afghanistan, for instance, or in some of these trade matters, these global trade matters that we've been talking about this afternoon, that the United States and Canada is also particularly good at the flip side of leadership, which is responsibility and accountability. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think that we have an obligation to continue to exercise, and an obligation to bring other countries into that mindset, that leadership and empowerment brings with it the flip side of accountability and responsibility. And I think this is a very important notion to continue to try to put forward in places like Russia, the former countries of the former Soviet Union, Central Asia, and the Caucasus that Ambassador Yalowitz and I have spent a lot of time in, but also particularly in connection with the Arab Spring and the kinds of thinking and potentially new institutions, new relationships, new internal institutions that are being brought forward in that region as well. I'd like to leave my comments there as something maybe to talk about a little bit more and think about tomorrow as well. Thank you all.
Thank you all very, very much. That was a very rich discussion. We're going to turn now to questions and answers. I'm going to do something I don't ordinarily do, but I'm going to ask the first question because I just can't resist. All four of you have spoken very much about the close relationships, and I totally agree. But I think also I'd like you to just discuss on some of the issues where we do not agree, how do we handle them? Because I think this is also very instructive. And the one that I want to call attention to is the Northwest Passage. Deborah mentioned the critical importance to Canada of the Arctic, and certainly it is to the United States. But we have a disagreement on that issue, and I was wondering if the two of you might want to discuss, what that disagreement is and how we handle it.
Show us.
No, we don't.
No, we don't. I mean, basically, I would say that there's a little bit of, for now, agreeing to disagree.
Yeah.
But not meaning this in any real sense, metaphorically only. Push will come to shove, and we will have to sort this one out. But for now, I think the party line is that we will agree to disagree, and we will look at other aspects of the North where we can cooperate and work.
Why don't you just quickly explain what the issue is, too? Go ahead.
No, I'm going to do what diplomats do, and I'm going to take your question and give you my answer.
Good.
I'm going to give you two examples of issues that we do disagree on, and I'm going to tell you how the U.S. and Canada resolve their differences. So one is a dispute we have over the territory of the Beaufort Sea, way up north. And there are many reasons why we dispute, but what's really in play here is that everyone assumes that there are vast resources beneath the Beaufort Sea. So the way we're resolving this is every summer, Canadians and American scientists embark together on Coast Guard ships and go out and map the Beaufort Sea. They share the data with each other, and then once we've finished mapping and sharing the data, then we're going to get around to resolving the dispute. And that's how we handle things. The other is softwood lumber, which you've probably heard about for a decade, right? We finally did come to an agreement on softwood lumber, and the agreement has a mechanism for dispute resolution. And so softwood lumber raised its ugly head again during the past year, and the way we resolved it is we've sent it to arbitration. There will be a decision, and both sides will abide by whatever decision comes forward.
Good. Okay, now we can take questions, and as usual practice at Dickey Center events, students have first shot. So if a student is in the audience and wants to raise a question, go right ahead. And there's a microphone if you just wait a moment.
Just an extension of your answer, I was just curious, do you think that approach towards sending out scientists from both countries to solve this dispute, could that approach be used to solve the dispute in the South China Sea between the countries, like China, all the countries laying claim?
Question.
Yeah. Let me try.
Good question.
I'll try for an answer, not knowing a lot about Canada policy or China policy. No, it would not work. And it would be nice if it did. It would be very nice if it did. But you would start with whose secrets whose boat are you, whose ship are you going to be on? How classified is the equipment on the ship, or how secret is it? What's the access that each group of scientists would have? Are they really scientists or are they really spies? You get into all those kinds of oh my God issues, is what I always call them, and which means that to solve the problem the way Jim described it, there is a fundamental level of trust. Exactly. It's deep trust. Okay. So those issues don't come up. So, but if you're trying to solve the Spratly Islands problem, you have to start with a much more detailed discussion of, whose ship, whose radio gear, who gets access, all that kind of thing.
Good.
Yeah, I think what I would have just added to that is that it's both the issue itself in terms of how difficult the issue is, but it's also the two sides that are negotiating and the trust and the history between those two sides. And I think in terms of some of the irritants that Canada and the U.S. continues to deal with, there is this huge preponderance of evidence of our work, of us working out our differences. There is this trust. There is this integrated interdependence. And so there's a sense that we will make our way through these issues, even when they get as difficult as softwood lumber. And when, the Northwest Passage and transit is frequent enough that it becomes an issue, then we'll have to look at that. But I think, South China Sea, it's also a reflection of the parties who are at the table.
Good.
Absolutely.
Next question. Yeah, right back here. The microphone's coming to you. Just turn around. Good.
Okay, so I know the international security discussion is going to be tomorrow, but I had a question about Canada's opinion of United States drone use, especially now that it's increasing and they have a new base in the Horn of Africa. And so what is Canada's opinion on drone use to combat terrorism in, let's say, Yemen, and how that affects our relationship?
I don't know specifically what our position would be with regard to the use of drone use in Yemen. I think that we see drone use as part of the military arsenal that is used by another country within their military and defense policy. So I think that, for what we've experienced, certainly in Afghanistan and Pakistan, very, very difficult issue, but I think it's part of the new arsenal of warfare. I think in terms of Yemen, I don't know specifically. I can check and see if we've actually declared on that. I doubt that we have at this stage. Louise, do you have? I don't.
Oh.
Well, I think it's a good illustration of the difference between the two types of countries.
Yes.
Canada does not necessarily have a formed view of what the best strategy is to deal with Yemen.
Exactly.
We are probably a little more selective in the issues in which we engage because we're not a big power. So that's why I would be surprised if we had a very strong views on that particular subject, simply because we're not a big player in Yemen.
Good.
Let me just add one comment, just from my old NATO hat.
Yeah.
That could be an issue
Right.
that the U.S. and Canada would discuss under a NATO umbrella.
Yeah.
We might go to our Canadian colleagues and say, is this something that we should discuss in NATO? Is this something that we might bring into NATO?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
in
that
that
would be a little
context.
sanity check issue that I might
Good.
But
suggest.
presumably we are comfortable with the drones being used over Pakistan. I don't know.
I think we have not stated an objection.
There are a student question here.
See, I'm retired, I can ask all
yeah.
these questions. She's not.
Hello. So my question to you guys is, Ambassador Lyons mentioned how the world itself is globalizing, but yet, in addition to the world globalizing, each countries within the border, Canada and U.S., have become globalized. You mentioned how Canada is like a mosaic company, how 1 in 5 Canadians are foreign-born, and definitely a lot of foreign populations in the United States as well. So I was just wondering, in this globalizing economy and also taking into consideration the internal globalizations that's occurring in both of the respective countries, how is that going to affect our relationship, not in the present, well, maybe in the present also, but in the near future, far future, with the growing kind of perspective, definitely within special interest, kind of visions in those regards.
Are you referring, how's it going to change our relationship between the two countries, between
the two
U.S.
countries. Not change, but just effect.
So influence.
Influence.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And in fact, one of the things I was doing in anticipation of coming here this week was I was looking at our, the characteristic of Canada's new immigrants. Our immigration policies are a little bit different. In any case, we have quite a focus on economic immigration. The U.S. has a tendency to be much more family-centric. But it's very interesting. Our immigration, our population is becoming, if you'd like, more Pacific, more Asian, as I think the U.S. Population is becoming more Latin, if you'd like, in terms of, again, and I think that will have an influence. I think it will have an influence on our domestic policies, and I think it'll have an influence on our international policies. How? I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I think we have to see how that unfolds. I think that we will, and we are working very hard on having a much closer engagement with the Pacific Rim countries. And certainly we're working on economic agreements with Japan, with China, with India, and we will continue that work. We're obviously, as I said earlier, very cognizant of the hemisphere of the Americas and working there, but I think that you will see the Canadian the characterization of the Canadian population continue to change. We take in about 250,000 immigrants every year, and I think we're seeing a change in the politics of the country. We're seeing a change in the culture. I think it's just getting richer and richer. We're less European than we used to be, and much more of that mosaic, with that mosaic tending toward the Pacific, whereas the U.S. is changing, I think, with a much stronger Latin influence. I don't think we can predict what that change will be, and how that will influence, but I think you're quite right to point it out. It will definitely influence. Jim?
Please, Louise.
Louise?
Canada has been a mosaic for a long time. It's a country of immigration just like the United States, and therefore you have always had strong communities from various parts of the world. I would say on the whole, it has not had a major impact on foreign policy per se. Yes, it has at times brought up certain issues and complicated certain issues. To be very specific, for instance, there was an important Tamil community in Canada that was very active in support of the Tamils in Sri Lanka, and that created some foreign policy challenge, but it also created some domestic challenges. Same with some other communities that remain very, very tied to the politics in their own country. But I think you would find that much more in Europe, where the foreign residents remain very tied to their country of origin and tend to import more of the politics of their country than you find in Canada. And I suspect in the United States, immigrants come to Canada to make a living, to turn a page, to start afresh, and they don't necessarily become very engaged in pressing the Canadian government to intervene in the politics of their country of origin. So it is a factor, but it's not nearly as important a factor as you would think, judging by the numbers. You'd think that Canadian foreign policy would be totally determined by the pressures from the various groups. In fact, well, I've been out of the Canadian service for 10 years, but the last time I looked, it was a factor, but it wasn't as heavy a factor as you would imagine.
I think just as a simple example would be, the number of Haitian Canadians, and the fact that Canada has a history in the Caribbean in any case. And so for us, when the earthquake happened in Haiti, it was very easy for Canadians right across the country to respond because many of us had Haitian Canadian neighbors, in certain pockets across the country. But I give these as positive examples. I think that it will have a positive influence, both domestically and internationally.
Yeah, I think also, the U.S. demography is changing drastically, and I honestly believe that, that's one of these sort of hidden agenda items of American politics today. It doesn't really get discussed, but I really believe that that is a very important part of sort of our political evolution right now, is the fact that our population is changing, and I think some people, either consciously or subconsciously, don't like it. But next question from a student. I think there was one more hand that I saw here. Yeah.
So I've heard there's been a recent push by the Obama administration and the IRS to crack down on U.S. Tax accounts and U.S. Americans abroad, basically. And, Canada probably has more Americans abroad than anywhere on Earth. And it goes into issues like bank privacy and regulations and all of those. So is there anything anyone on the panel has to say about that issue?
This is not for the Canadian government. This is for the American government to respond to.
It's a
Explain
very
it, Jim.
well. It's actually a very sophisticated question. There have been a couple of recent changes that have caused consternation, certainly in Canada. Really, two elements. The first is the U.S. government has announced that it's going to start cracking down on American citizens who have foreign bank accounts, overseas bank accounts, but who have not reported those bank accounts. And they're specifically bank accounts over $10,000. I'm sorry, it's a complex issue, but I'll try and whip through it. The real problem is that in a place like Canada, there are 1 million plus American citizens, many of them dual nationals who have lived all their lives in Canada, but have American citizenship for some reason. They were born there, or they had an American parent or whatever. In fact, they have never filed a tax return and may not even know that they were supposed to file a tax return. In fact, every American citizen must file a tax return every year. When you file your tax return, there's a box on there that says, do you have a foreign bank account over $10,000? And if you check yes, you must then file a piece of paper which describes that bank account, right? So what the U.S. government has decided to do is crack down on those people who have not reported those bank accounts. And the penalties appear to be very, very stiff. So this has caused a lot of consternation in Canada. The other thing that's causing consternation is that the U.S. government has decided that foreign financial institutions, banks, have to report that they have American clients for much the same reason, so that the United States can recover tax income from those American citizens. So this has caused great worry among foreign financial institutions that they're going to have to go to great lengths to ferret out American citizens among their client base. It looks like this won't be as draconian as it immediately appears, but this is all sort of being worked out now, and it will go into effect in 2014.
I did want to recognize.
I was just saying, I was smiling when Louise was saying that Canadian news doesn't often get on the first few pages of the New York Times, but our Minister of Finance last Friday did send a letter to the editor of the New York Times speaking quite pointedly about this issue. So I think I might have brought a copy of the letter with me.
I did want to recognize Patrick Binns, who's arrived. Patrick is the Consul General of Canada in New England, and very warm welcome to you, Patrick. It's very good to see you here. Okay, we have time for a few more questions, so who has a question? Please, Chuck.
Ken's first question had to do with a geographic area in the Arctic, and I had noticed that also that Ambassador Lyons, when talking about some of Canada's connections with 3 of the 4 BRIC countries, didn't mention the R. And which just let me finish. My question is. Concerning the Arctic, concerning the mapping of the Arctic, it's nice that the U.S. and Canada are more or less on the same page. Could any of you discuss the differing points of view that particularly Russia, but others like Norway and so forth, might have on the mapping, with the idea that maybe there's a lot of money to be made in the bottom of the Bering Sea?
Yeah, I can address that very, very quickly because I don't want to take time away. The simple answer is that there is an international legal instrument, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and all of the Arctic Ocean coastal states have agreed several times now to have any territorial disputes adjudicated under that process, and that's exactly what Canada and the United States are doing now jointly. There's a lawyer at the Vermont Law School, Betsy Baker, who was on the Beaufort, on the Canadian icebreaker. We're going out there mapping what everyone is trying to do right now is to put forward the best possible argumentation as to why their continental shelves extended, go way, way, way out. And that's what the Russians are doing. The Danes are doing that. Everybody is doing that. But at the same time, everyone has committed themselves, to do this according to the procedures under the UN Law of the Sea Convention. And there's been a lot out there about wars and Cold Wars. I don't believe it. It could happen, but not if everyone adheres to it, including the United States. We've got to become a party to it. Any other questions?
I didn't mean to leave the R out. I noticed that actually myself as I was speaking, but I was referring to China and India and Brazil in terms of, we see Russia, I think, a little differently in terms of its evolution and as a member of the G8 and so forth.
Yeah.
So that was part of it.
Good.
If you feel that Russia is more or less playing by the rules here, fine, which is interesting.
They are so far. Keep your fingers crossed. But as I said, it's very important for us to become a party, and we're not going there right now. Anybody else? Oh, one more question here. Good.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about Stephen Harper's position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because I read an article in The Economist in May that basically said that he's taken a clear position in support of Israel in the conflict. And I was just hoping the panel could comment on this. It's quite interesting because Obama's been very critical of Israel's continued settlement activity, and it seems that Harper has, a position diverts from this, and also kind of doesn't really jive with. I feel like many Canadians feel that Canada should be a broker of kind of an honest broker of international relations, and I don't want to say neutral, but definitely have a kind of less strong position in favor of one side or the other. So I was just hoping the panel could comment on this.
Go ahead, Louise.
Yeah, it's probably easier for me to answer that. Yes, the position taken by Prime Minister Harper on the question of the Middle East and the Palestine question is different from that of the preceding government. It is foursquare behind Israel and has said so repeatedly. So the position they're taking on the UN vote is very much in line with what they've announced from the beginning. I hate to anticipate my presentation tomorrow, but fundamentally there is a big shift happening in Canada on the positioning of the country, how it wants to play internationally. Indeed, for decades, Canada valued this possibility to play the honest broker, which didn't mean you were neutral. You had your views, you had your principles. It didn't make you a neutral player, but it made you a player that, as Ambassador said earlier, meant that Canada was able to navigate among conflicting parties and views, and was well placed to try to tease out consensus. That's what it did in the UN for decades, and it was a deliberate choice. And I think it was based on the notion that if you take an active role as an honest broker or as a mediator or whatever, chances are the solution that came out was going to be at least not inimical to your own interests. If you end up holding the pen, you're not going to draft, you're not going to find a solution that goes totally contrary to your interests. So it was a way of exercising a middle power role that relied on being an activist on the international scene, on it's stepping forward to help find solutions and compromise. Confident in the notion that all these international conventions in which we've played so big a role in trying to achieve success, they're all conventions that we're very happy with, thank you very much, because we drafted them. We had a heavy role to play in drafting them. So that was the way that for many years. This time around, this government says we're different. We come from a different place. We're not sure that that's the best way for Canada. And I'm trying to be I'm from the old generation, so you know where my heart is. But to be fair to this government, it says, no, we don't think that's the best way for Canada to defend its own interests. That this notion that we're going to be a helpful fixer, that we're going to put a lot of our eggs in the UN, is not the best way to advance our interests. We're going to be much more focused on developing bilateral relationships. We don't like the UN. We don't believe in that stuff. I'm caricaturing just a little, but not much, and you don't have to comment. But, it's a government that comes with a different set. It's a government that believes more in beefing up its military. It's less keen on traditional peacekeeping. I don't think there's anything illegitimate about that. I think it's perfectly legitimate. A government gets elected, and in our system particularly, if you get your majority, you can actually govern according to what you think is best for the country. In the United States, it's much more complicated because your president doesn't have a free run. But in Canada, a prime minister that gets a majority in the House, which is now the case with the Conservative Party, has a free run. But in 4 years from now, there'll be elections and people will decide. I myself am not sure that the country, that the average Canadian has moved in the same way that the government has moved. But foreign policy is never an issue in elections. We don't. So that's why you have a fair amount of freedom on the part of a government to change orientation of the foreign policy, and that's what we're observing at the moment. I think on the question of Palestine and the recognition, my sense is that in all Western countries you have very deeply divided views. Yesterday, I was told that in France you have now 2 groups of parliamentarians that have met separately to argue. To put pressure on the president to go this way or that way, for or against, and that in both groups you find parliamentarians of all parties. So there are deep divisions. I'm sure you have the same in Canada. I don't know, I haven't seen a poll, but you would probably find people who think the prime minister is right in not voting yes, and you would find, I don't know what the proportion would be, but I don't think there would be an overwhelming majority one way or the other.
I would just add that, there are great changes taking place around the world, and there are changes taking place within Canada and the U.S. as people react to those changes that are happening globally. I think in Canada, as in the U.S., we are seeing shifts in the culture, in the politics. You have your own very well-known Tea Party that the Canadians are watching with great interest. I think we're seeing changes in Canada as well. I think Louise makes a very good point about, where your government is as compared to your population, but I would just say that Canadians watched, I think I can make this statement very clearly, the present government for 5 years, manage a minority government, and then chose to give them a majority. I think that that's quite a strong statement. I think what this government is saying is, as compared to the honest broker role, Canada is a middle power. Canada has limited resources. We have certain values. They make it very clear. We have certain values and certain interests. And we will act according to those values and interests. And in some cases, they may be unpopular, and we will deal with that. Because we will act from those values and from those interests. And they have a mandate, a majority from the Canadian population to do that for the next 4 years. And some of the positions may be popular, they may be unpopular, but they are certainly a democratically elected government that is playing out its policies as clearly set out. It's a little different in some cases, but it is what the Canadian public has requested, in essence. And I think it's part of what is happening in many parts of the world, where we are seeing a shift in the thinking as I think countries that have been dealing with almost a world that was somewhat calmer, perhaps. In spite of things like the Cold War, there was a sense of order. Now there is, I think, more of a sense of chaos, and I think we're seeing governments and populations around the world trying to react to that and trying to respond to that. And we're seeing different kinds of alliances, allegiances. And I think, an attempt, and I see it happening in the U.S., an attempt to try to clarify what is the dream, what is the vision of our society, and where are we going in the world. And I think some of that is happening in Canada right now in a very, very interesting way. And I don't think we can make too many strong value judgments on it. I think we have to wait and see how it turns out. I think that we've got an awful lot to be proud of.
Yeah, I think just in conclusion, this was a very, very good discussion at the very end. But I think all of you can appreciate, all 5 of us, we're career diplomats and still are. We've all experienced changes of government, changes of administration, and I think you've had a good insight now into the kinds of flexibility and the kinds of thinking, that we have to go through when you spend a lifetime as a career diplomat. But thank you. Yeah, a bit of a pretzel, yeah. Thank you, all 4 of you. That was an absolutely wonderful start today. Thank you all very much. Thank you.